it is our duty as Republicans and all members of Congress to use the power of the purse to defund the executive branch that is tyrannically at odds with the well-being of the American people. And with that, I would be delighted to yield to my good friend from West Virginia and appreciate his great service to our country and look forward to hearing from him.
Thank you. I appreciate the passion of my good friend from Texas, and many of the points he's making need to be heard and understood, even if it's uncomfortable. The truth has to be told. But Mr. Speaker, I rise today to talk about legislation I'm promoting to return the United States to the gold standard. As was discussed earlier, our nation is facing an inflation crisis not seen in over 40 years. Inflation is a regressive tax, hurting lower-income Americans more than anyone else. West Virginians have seen the value of their savings erode before their very eyes as a result of the reckless tax and spending spree of President Joe Biden and the Washington Democrats and an overzealous Federal Reserve. Thanks to Democrats, your 401k is now more like a 301k, and it'll go even lower if they stay in power. Today, our national debt is over $32 trillion, which is borrowed not only from Americans, but also from foreign adversaries. We know who's responsible for the current debt crisis, but the question has to be asked, what in our country's history allowed us to get to this point? The answer can actually be traced back to 1971, when President Richard Nixon took the United States off the gold standard. Rather than tackle the root causes of economic challenges, Nixon severed the dollar's convertibility to gold once and for all. President Nixon said at the time that that would actually combat inflation. Art Laffer, a well-known and respected economist, accurately warned that taking the United States off of the gold standard would actually only exacerbate these problems. What followed was a period of severe inflation, rivaled only by what we're seeing today. Domestic production became more expensive, and corporate profits declined. So companies were encouraged to shift production abroad, overseas, where labor costs were cheaper. Today, our number one economic rival is China, which continues to attract American companies due to the cheapness of production there. Now, the gold standard, as we know it, is not actually using the gold as currency, but rather tying the dollar bill directly to the value of that gold. Under the gold standard, any American would be able to trade their dollars for a fixed amount of gold. By linking the dollar to the value of gold, the money supply could only be increased if the supply of gold increases. This connection protects the purchasing power of your hard-earned tax dollar. The gold standard would protect against Washington's irresponsible spending habits and the creation of money out of thin air. Prices would be shaped by economics rather than instincts and wishes of federal bureaucrats. With the gold standard, no longer would our economy be at the mercy of the Federal Reserve and reckless Washington spenders. Through government mismanagement and economic manipulation, is it any surprise that many Americans are looking for alternatives to the U.S. dollar in cryptocurrencies? Americans are losing confidence in our currency. It is long past time for Congress to begin considering a return to the gold standard. That's why I'll be introducing legislation to do exactly that, as I have in previous Congresses. Under my proposal, the Secretary of the Treasury would define the U.S. dollar in terms of fixed weight of gold based on the market price, while allowing dollar bills to be exchanged for gold at that rate. Had the United States been on the gold standard or some other fixed standard, we would not be in the inflation crisis we're in today. I hope to work with the new Republican majority to make sure this issue gets the attention it deserves. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to address my bill, the Expanding Access for Capital for Rural Job Creators Act. Earlier this year, the House resoundingly passed my bipartisan Expanding Access to Capital for Rural Job Creators Act. Rural small businesses face unique challenges that big city businesses do not. Nearly 20% of the United States population lives in rural areas, and yet businesses in rural areas raised under 2% of total capital over the last 3 years. West Virginia, which I'm so proud to represent, is a very rural state where no city has a population greater than 50,000 people. So my legislation simply requires the Security and Exchange Commission, SEC, advocate for Small Business Capital Formation Office, to identify and report to Congress those challenges rural small businesses face when trying to access our capital markets. This will make it easier for Congress to then act to address these problems. My bill would make it easier for Congress to do our jobs and make sure rural small businesses, like in West Virginia, are not left behind. And I hope the Senate takes up this common sense measure promptly. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding. I yield back the time to the gentleman from Texas. Keep up the good work.
I thank the gentleman from West Virginia and appreciate his strong passion representing the great people of West Virginia. And he's a good friend and glad that he could join us here today. Earlier, I was talking about the need for this country to reclaim economic growth in order to dig ourselves out of the hole that this absurd institution and lack of leadership from Washington, D.C. has created for the American people in the form of $32 trillion of debt, ridiculously stagnant economic growth. After decades of being able to achieve growth in the 3 and 4% range, we are now sitting in the doldrums of 1% type economic growth. But that might even be rather robust in the era of Joe Biden. And so I'd like to yield to my friend and gentleman from North Carolina to expand upon this important point.
I thank Mr. Roy for yielding. And Mr. Roy, of course, the president's budget recommendation came over a month late yesterday. And there was one detail I read in the New York Times, so it must be true, although it's the only place I've had a chance to see it yet. And what immediately popped into my mind when I read this detail is that Karine Jean-Pierre said last week, I can remember saying it, that the president's economic plan is working for the American people. And that popped back into my head because the detail disclosed by the New York Times is the administration predicts economic growth in this fiscal year, not 3.5%, not 4% certainly, not 2.5%, not 1.5%, 0.6%. You have to start talking about economic growth in what the economists call basis points because it's so small. So if the economic plan of the Biden administration is working for the American people, that means 60 basis points of economic growth anticipated in the year. And guess what the Biden administration says about that? We should do nothing different. We should keep doing the same thing that's producing 0.6% of economic growth, except one other thing. We should pile the burden of a lot more taxes on the economy. Because apparently that's going, because what do we need? 30 basis points of economic growth? Republicans believe we need to change. I yield back to the gentleman from Texas.
I appreciate my friend from North Carolina. I'd inquire how much time we have remaining.
The gentleman has 8 minutes remaining.
Well, I appreciate it. I don't know that I'll use every bit of that. I appreciate the point the gentleman from North Carolina just made because it's critically important, and it merits at least one final repetition, that this great country racked up the level of debt that we currently have today relative to the size of its economy in 1946. But why was that? To rid the world of fascism, to confront our enemies, defeat those enemies, and protect this great country. And then we embarked for 50 years and grew ourselves to the point to be able to balance the budget by 2000 with strong economic growth. It took that much time. And here we sit today in 2023 with $32 trillion of debt, sitting at the president's own admission of 60 basis points economic growth this year. He wants his grand solution to be, oh, we'll just rack up $17 trillion more debt in the next decade because I'm going to save $3 trillion by taxing the American people and regulating the American people. It doesn't work. This is President Biden's actual form of voodoo economics. He's going to level this country, layer mountains more debt on our kids and grandkids, all while funding the very things that are undermining our ability to have economic growth, prosperity, and freedom. As I noted before, the millions of dollars going to the EPA to turn an American citizen into a felon and put him into jail because he had a pond on his ranch. The millions of dollars in the name of clean air that is going to regulate with methane regulations to drive the price of gas, the price of energy up for the average American. Every single American should demand of his or her representative in this body that we stand up to a tyrannical executive branch overstepping its bounds, undermining our freedom, undermining economic growth, and every member of this body should look to cut spending this year of the federal bureaucracy, return it to pre-COVID levels as a baseline, save $3 trillion by getting government out of the way, restore economic growth and hope and opportunity for our kids and grandkids, stop funding the very things that are undermining our well-being, secure our country, secure our border, have a sparingly used but lethal non-woke military that will kill people and destroy things when they need to, and restore the greatness of this country by shrinking Washington and growing America. And with that, I would yield back to the chair.